1. Back when I was a small child, years ago, I lived with my mother, brother, and grandparents. The house we lived in was very old, built around the very early 1900s. My mother lived there when she was a teen, and according to her, the previous owners were very old, so I assume that they're deceased by now. Strange things happen a lot in that house, according to my mother. When my great-grandparents died, she would smell their perfume and cologne at random. In a way, they were still watching over us from the dead, which was comforting, to say the least. But one day when I was around the age of 13 or 14, I was up till 3 a.m. playing video games. Everyone else was asleep. I heard footsteps outside my room and paused to check who it was. I thought it was my brother or one of my grandparents walking to the bathroom, but I didn't see them. I heard the footsteps again, but this time they came from the attic. The thing about the attic is that the door didn't have a doorknob. It had a keyhole, and once you opened it with the key, you had to pull the door open. The attic was locked. Some people asked me, maybe it was an animal. The footsteps sounded too heavy to be a tiny animal, and it was in the summer. Animals only came in the attic in the winter. Someone also asked me, maybe it was a homeless person. Kind of a silly question. There was no other way to enter the attic except through the door. The windows were too small for a human to climb through. I also felt a strange presence as if someone else was in the house besides my family. My family said they experienced weird things in the house, and it was my first time experiencing something like that. I don't know the history of the house, only that it was built 100+ years ago. When I started high school, we moved from that house because the bills were skyrocketing, and my grandparents could no longer afford it. I'm now living in a house almost similar to my old one with my mother. We moved here around 2017. The owner of this house was pretty old too. She lived here when she was a child. Her daughter told us that originally her brother was going to own the house if their mother were to pass away, but the brother ended up passing away first, thus selling the house to us. Reason why I bring this up is because my mother and I have experienced weird things in this house. I would hear footsteps in the basement when no one was down there. I also felt a strange sense of discomfort every time I went into the attic. My mother also used to smell cigars late at night. Maybe someone was smoking outside late at night, but our neighborhood was quiet at night. The smell actually came from the attic. Later on, we found out from my grandfather that the son of the previous owner, who was supposed to inherit the house, died in the attic, and he was smoking before his last moments, which explains a lot. But that was when we moved here. We haven't experienced anything since. I still feel unease when I go near the attic, but I guess it's because of the fact that someone died up there before I moved here, and that he's probably haunting the house. That's my whole experience so far. I've been in this house for 4 years now, and have yet to experience anything else, neither has my mother. Once we started making changes to the house, like painting the walls, changing the floors, and getting rid of some things, that presence we felt slowly vanished. 2. This story takes place in a farmstead in Ireland. The activity was particularly strong in the cabin, cowshed. Really, I don't know when this started or what it is. However, I am about 80% sure it's demonic in nature. My family is extremely Christian. The farmstead has had countless blessings in it and countless masses. The house itself was built on a famine trail. Basically, on the left side of the house in the living room, there's a trail. A trail people during the famine used to take to the shore to mass. A long time ago, there would be activity. Stuff ripped out from walls, footsteps, voices, possibly apparitions. A step was put in outside so the spirits would take a different route around the house. So now it's ceased. But now I think something else has moved in, feeding off their energy. It first happened about 3 years ago. Late at night I'd smell sulfur, hear rustling. Nothing much. Then I would feel an unbearable feeling of terror. A burning sensation in my chest would rise up like heartburn around 3 a.m. I would squeeze my eyes shut because if I opened them I'd die. It was terrifying, and would always take place from 3 to 4 a.m. That's the weak part. In the cowshed outside, it's even worse. There's just such an oppressive feeling. Once I think I even saw something, crouched in the corner. There was nothing shadowy about it, nothing ghostly about it. It was solid, a woman, I think. Back turned, crouched in the corner. I didn't see it first, I smelt it, like rotting flesh and sulfur. I'd gone in for my skateboard that was leaning against the wall. When I smelt that, I spun around, spying it in the far end of the cowshed, crouched near some farm tools. As soon as I saw it, I knew it saw me. Even though it stayed turned the whole time, just an oppressive feeling of guilt and terror. I felt unreasonably violent. I wanted to kill something. But all my feelings just faded, and I just felt numb, and I realized I was walking towards it. As soon as I realized, it all bubbled up again, and I could hear screaming so loud. I turned heel and ran, locking the door behind me and sprinting back inside. I've never felt anything like that before. It happened once. I've been back since. Back in that cowshed since. Though I still feel uneasy in there, and my dog always whimpers in there. I'm going back there in a week or so for Easter. Not looking forward to it. Any thoughts on what it could be? 3. Okie dokie. I moved up to Arkansas about at the end of May in 2019 to this apartment. Now, I've never done anything research-wise in this place other than the area and price, of course. Moved in all fine and didn't experience anything in the house for a bit. However, I soon was getting dark figures in the back of my car. I'd get ready to pull away for work and I'd look in my rearview mirror and the classic see something looking at you type deal. At first it was a flash of a shadow. Then it would turn to a set of red eyes that would fade out, a couple weeks later. I'm not startled easily, but I can definitely say I wasn't exactly prepared for red eyes looking back at me. Over the next month, I'd find myself waking up hearing footsteps in my carpet, like someone was walking into my room at night. Thinking it was my cat half the time, who often comes in to cuddle, I ignored it. Until she was next to me, and we both heard it. I shrugged it off as nothing to be worried about. If it was a spirit or something, it's fine. I rely on my cat's reaction a lot, and if she wasn't startled, then I shouldn't be. This would escalate over the next months as well. Again, I'd find myself waking to the sound of footsteps again. Only this time I'd feel something at my feet. It felt like a hand pressing against my blankets to find my foot. Being agitated, I'd try to move and kick like it was my cat or something. Only I couldn't move at all. I remember feeling that hand move from my feet to the side of the bed, and then I could move again. Sleep paralyzed? Was I hallucinating? A few nights later it would ramp up again, and I mean a full figure this time. I was woken again to find a woman standing directly over me with her hand on my stomach. She was wearing a white gown of sorts, I believe, and see-through. She had dark shoulder-length hair, round cheeks, and a pointed chin. Her features were fuzzy, being a ghost or something, I guess. I could see her eyes, but they were dark and sunken. But she was staring right at me. I could sit up some, and I was angry, more so than scared. I've seen ghosts in my past and never really was bothered. Being disturbed from my sleep when I worked 16-plus-hour shifts, military, I'm not a happy camper. But the first thing is it wouldn't respond to my anger of go away. It wasn't until I asked nicely, "Can you please leave me alone? I'm trying to sleep." Did she fade away, and her hands left my body. Fast forward again to last night. I was awoken to a voice speaking on the left side of my room. I can't remember what she said right now. And a few minutes went by before the woman again, she was holding my legs. I know it wasn't my neighbors, I know their voices well enough through the walls. Apartments, mind you, but they aren't paper thin. My cat was snoozing at my shoulder. She's a heavy sleeper, or she wasn't threatened, I have no idea. But she was snoring in my left ear, while this woman leaned down to my right ear. She spoke again, barely a whisper. "Hey, hey, and some other words, but again, I can't remember. I could move, I could speak, I could feel the breath in my right ear, too. It was wild. Again, I responded angry and with force and shrugged it away, at least I hoped. She stopped and vanished a minute after. Looking around, my cat picked her head up and looked around as well. Mad as hell. I rolled over and went back to sleep. Well, that's my story of the figure woman. Let me know what y'all think. Are my eyes playing tricks on me? Think it's something for me to be worried about? Honestly, I have no idea. I'm just really mad about losing sleep. 4. A few years ago, I worked as a masseuse at a spa hotel. I loved my job and hung out with several of my colleagues even in my spare time. We often worked long days, and since I lived about 1 hour from the facility, it often happened that I stayed over at the hotel. Me and another masseuse, Hannah, sometimes shared a room. Hannah had worked at the hotel for several years and said there were some rooms she wanted to avoid. One evening after dinner at our favorite restaurant, we went to the front desk to check in. We would work another day and then be free for a few days. We paid and received our keys. I noticed that we were given room number 37, one of the rooms Hannah had warned me about. Hannah and I exchanged glances, and Hannah turned to the receptionist. "Excuse me, but is there any chance we could get another room?" "Unfortunately not. The hotel is almost fully booked." We got the answer. Hannah and I received our receipt and took the elevator down to the first floor. Since it was getting late, we brushed our teeth and went straight to bed. I could not shake the feeling that someone was standing next to the bed, right at my bedside table. It's hard to explain, but it somehow felt like it was a middle-aged man. I pulled the quilt up to my chin and decided I was just imagining it. To calm down, I took a deep breath and adjusted. What happened later is even harder to explain. I have never experienced anything like it. A thought popped into my head, but it didn't feel like the thought came from me.
"You can't shut me out."
A wave of shock rushed through my body. "Hannah!" I had never had time to finish my question before Hannah answered. "Yep, there's definitely someone in your side of the bed." I immediately turned on the light. The room looked just like usual. "I told you I did not like this room," said Hannah, and I mumbled that I understood why. We slept restlessly that night, but no more strange thoughts popped into my head. In the afternoon of the next day, Hannah came looking for me. She told me that she had passed room 37. The room had new guests traveling with their dogs. Right at the beginning of the corridor, Hannah could hear the dogs barking. A woman's voice said, "I don't understand what's wrong with them." A male voice replied, "Beats me, they've never acted like this before." Hannah and I worked for a few more years at the hotel, but we never stayed in room 37 again. Whoever visited us that night, we are convinced that he was not made of flesh and blood. 5. Earliest memories. At the age of about 5 years old, my bedroom was located at the end of a long hallway. If you entered the house through the front door, straight ahead was a dining area and kitchen, and to the right was a more formal dining area and lounge room. To the left was a hallway. Going down the hallway were 2 bedrooms to the left, and a bathroom and separate toilet to the right. Directly at the end of the hallway, it led to the 3rd bedroom. This was my room. If you entered the room, my bed was to the left and against the wall. To the right was my wardrobe. Directly in front as you entered the room was the window, and in front of the window was a wicker baby bassinet and a small wooden high chair. These had my mother's composite dolls, approx circa 1940s and 50s. I was never really permitted to play with these dolls, they were mostly decoration. One of the dolls resembled a small toddler and was approximately 2.5 feet tall. The second doll resembled a baby, and was approximately the size of the average newborn. I remember one day looking at the larger doll which sat in the high chair. I noticed the left hand in this doll moved in front of my eyes. Not being able to make sense of this, but knowing that it was not normal, because these dolls had no type of mechanisms, I ran to my mother in tears, telling her how the doll's hand had moved. My mother scolded me, telling me that it was my imagination and insisted that I stop staring at the dolls, waiting for something to happen. This was something I had only just started to do on that day, as I was positive about what I had seen and wanted to see if it would happen again so that I could show my mother. Nothing more happened at that point, so after a few days the incident was forgotten. A few months later, my mother purchased me a new pajama bag which resembled an Ernie doll from Sesame Street. It was essentially just an empty Ernie that could be used as a bag for short sleepovers. This bag was hung on the outside of my wardrobe, on one of the handles. Whenever I woke up during the night when I was a child and needed the bathroom, I would walk through the house in complete darkness, only turning the lights on once I had entered the toilet and had the door shut. I did this so that I would not wake anyone else in the house. One night I woke, and usually my bedroom door was open a few centimeters but was mostly closed. This one night my door was slightly more open than usual, but I did not find this odd at first because my mother usually checked on me during the night, and I just assumed that she had not shut the door as much as what she usually did. I was just about to step out into the completely dark hallway when I noticed something that terrified me. Just 2 or so meters away from me in the hallway was this Ernie doll. Although it was completely dark, I could easily see this doll. It was not glowing, but was a bright orange as if it were daylight. The doll was upright as if it were standing by itself and looking at me. It started walking down the hallway towards me and talking. It greeted me by saying, "Hello, Krista, let's play!" His voice was exactly like Ernie from Sesame Street. I completely shut my bedroom door on this scene and ran back to my bed while hiding under the covers. At some point, I fell back to sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I was completely confused. Somehow I had become turned around and my head was at the end of the bed where my feet should have been. I looked over at my wardrobe and the Ernie doll was gone. My bedroom door was completely shut, and when I got out of bed and opened the door, the doll bag was directly outside my bedroom door on the side of the door where the handle was. I became so terrified of this doll bag that I refused to have it in my room where I slept. I never bothered to tell my mother what had happened that night, especially considering her reaction to the older dolls that had happened before this. I may have considered that it was a nightmare and that I had dreamt the whole scenario. But the doll being outside of my room and my door being completely shut, the only thing my mother could get from me was that I was completely terrified and did not even want to play in my room with that doll there. She promptly resolved the issue by giving this doll bag to our neighbor who had a son the same age as myself. She never pressed me as to why I suddenly become so terrified of this doll, and I never spoke of it again. Everything went back to normal, and I noticed no bizarre, unexplainable behavior until some years later. This time I was about 8 years old and was staying at my grandparents' house. They lived on a farm that has an actually really morbid history. The name of the farm is called Native Rock, and there is a beautiful river that runs along the boundary of this property. On this river, there is a large rock on the opposite side of the river, which is actually called Native Rock. When I was a child, I was told a story about this place, and although, as an adult, I have tried to research it myself online, there is nothing online about it that I can find. Part of Australia's dark history is that sometime in the 1800s, European settlers attempted to cull some of the native population. To save bullets, they would chain or tie aboriginals up in a line, and then force them off cliff faces or similar. The story I was told was that a lot of natives along the northwest coast of Tasmania were rounded up and had rocks or weights attached to their feet, and were forced to jump from this rock, essentially ending in their demise. As the river was over 30 feet deep just beneath this rock, my grandparents' home was on that farm property, but was approximately 2 kilometers from the river where the rock was located. I had spent plenty of nights sleeping at my grandparents', and had never had a problem there before, and had never once felt frightened while staying there. The bedroom I was staying in had 2 single beds on the left side of the room, and to the right there were massive built-in wardrobes that lined the far wall. During this night, I woke for no apparent reason, The bed I was sleeping in was closest to the door, over in the far corner in front of me, but to my left, in the corner between a window that was on the far side of the room and the wardrobe, I noticed something glowing. It was about the same size and height as myself at the time, and appeared to be a sort of electric light blue. It had features of a human. It had a face, and even appeared to be clothed, but as far as gender, features, or even the style of clothing goes, I could not tell you, because I was so scared that I pulled the covers of the bed over my head. My eyes were wide open in fear, even though I had my head covered by the blankets. This was when I noticed what was going on in the bed. There seemed to be what looked like mini lightning coming off my bare legs and striking the blankets above me. It resembled something like a plasma ball. This phenomenon was coming off from all over my bare legs. Although I was not in pain and could not feel this electric charge at all, I was even more terrified, so I clenched my eyes closed while still hiding under the blankets. After a while, I fell back to sleep again, and when I awoke in the morning, everything looked as it should. For years afterwards, I considered perhaps it was nothing more than a bad dream, as I did not believe in ghosts or other unexplainable entities. Nothing noticeable occurred again for many years, not until I was about 13 years old. Again, I was at my grandparents' house, but this time I was in a different room at the other end of the house. I was staying at my grandparents to celebrate Christmas with my large family. The farm I was staying on had 2 houses and a detached bungalow belonging to the main farmhouse. My grandparents' house was the main farmhouse and the oldest house on the property. I am not certain about the age of this house, but I'm assuming it was built about the 1930s, 1940s. As the main house was full of different family members, I stayed in a spare room at the furthest end of the house, which was usually my grandmother's sewing room. But there was also a spare bed in there for moments such as Christmas. I had a plastic stocking full of chocolates and lollies that someone had given me for Christmas, and this was leaning up against my grandmother's sewing machine to the right side of myself. The door to this room was on my left and at the foot of the bed. I don't remember what drew my attention to the plastic stocking, but it had been sitting in the same position for hours. I had the light on and had been reading in an attempt to make myself tired so I could get a full night's sleep. I looked over to my right at the plastic stocking, and this was when I noticed that it gradually started to move. Instead of leaning backwards on the sewing machine, it stood up straight and balanced completely upright for about 10 seconds. And then gradually it started to lean in the direction towards myself. Eventually it ended up dropping, falling over in the direction opposite of what it had been leaning for the past couple of hours. Although I found this to be an extremely odd event, I was no longer a young child, and I was completely perplexed as to what had made this plastic stocking behave the way it did. I did not hide or become agitated or frightened. I was just astounded. This was all that occurred that night that I actually noticed. This particular Christmas was a terrible one for myself. I had been extremely close to my grandfather. Not the one who lived on this farm, but my other grandfather, although I loved them both. I was the only grandchild of my other grandfather, and he doted on me as much as I loved him and my grandmother. Earlier that year, my grandfather had a heart attack. This was about his 8th heart attack, and every time I had been told that he had had another heart attack, I usually just brushed it off, but in July 1989, my grandfather had another heart attack. When my aunt informed me of this for the first time ever, I reacted drastically to the news. Breaking down in tears, I insisted that my grandfather was going to pass away, and that he would not survive that year. I was chastised by my aunt, and eventually they were able to calm me down. Then, as that Christmas approached, the year that the plastic stocking moved, my grandfather's health started to decline again. I was crushed by this news, and every year whenever I went to my grandparents' farm during the summer months, I would spend most of my free time camping down at the river across from Native Rock. New Year's Eve approached, and because we were underaged, my cousin and myself managed to sneak a few beers and decided to go camping so that we could get drunk for New Year's Eve but not have to worry about how much noise we were making, or being caught by the adults. We ended up going to bed at about 2 a.m. At this point in my life, as it is with most teenagers, I really appreciated my sleep. And when I was camping, I usually slept until 11 a.m. or so. For whatever reason, I woke just after 7 a.m., and although I had been expecting some resemblance of a hangover, I felt absolutely fine. I looked across at my sleeping cousins, and not wanting to wake them, I decided to walk across the farm and head up to one of the 2 farmhouses. I went to the newer house, which was my aunt's. Although it was a further walk, I knew she would be home, and I felt like being in her company. It took me at least an hour of walking to get to her house. I arrived at about 8:30 a.m., as my aunt had just finished milking the cows. I just sat in her kitchen for the morning talking with her. I explained how I had woken up early, and not wanting to wake up my cousins, I decided to head up to the houses instead. After a few hours, at approximately 1 p.m., her phone started to ring. At the exact moment her phone started to ring, I started to cry, not a little bit, but close to hysteria. My aunt looked at me in shock, not knowing what was wrong, and wondered if she should answer the phone, or see if I was okay first. She decided to quickly answer the phone and see who was calling, and if she needed to, she would call them back. I remember her greeting the caller, then she went quiet. The next words that she spoke triggered even more tears. I remember her saying to whoever was calling, "I think she already knows." She passed the phone to me as she walked off into another room in the attempts to give me some privacy. It was my father on the phone, who was calling to advise me that my grandfather had passed away at 7:05 that morning. I was proven wrong, though. The mini meltdown that I had earlier in 1989 during June, where I claimed that he would not last a year, I'm not sure if any family member told him or not, but he was able to hold on until just after 7 a.m. on New Year's Day. That night I wanted to be alone, and so I walked out into an open field and decided to lay down and contemplate the whole situation. For years prior to my grandfather passing away, he had tried on many occasions to show me where the Southern Cross constellation was, and for whatever reason I could never find it or see it. Seconds after I lay down in the grass in this field and looked up at the clear night sky, my gaze was drawn directly to the Southern Cross constellation. After many years of trying to find and see it, I find it bizarre that the first night of his passing, I was not only able to see it for the first time, but I found it immediately as I laid down and started to look at the stars. I don't necessarily believe this to be paranormal, but surely a massive coincidence, as are some of the points made about his passing. I only mention my grandfather in these writings, as there is a possibility that my attachment is my grandfather. I did have other paranormal events that I witnessed prior to his passing, but they were very few and fleeting. The event of losing my grandfather was the most distressing event I had ever endured in my short life up to that point. I was a mess. But as time went on, I was able to pull myself together and move on. The following summer, I cut my usual trip to Tasmania shorter, and went on a family holiday with a friend and her family to Lake Eildon in Victoria instead. One particular day, a group of teenagers all around the same age were hanging out together. We were bored with the usual swimming or fishing, but Lake Eildon is a rural area, and unless you lived there, there was really not a lot to do. Someone suggested that we attempt a seance, and made a Ouija board from pieces of paper. Each piece of paper had a letter of the alphabet, yes, no, etc., and we arranged these scraps of paper onto a caravan tabletop. We used a very heavy tumbler as a planchette. None of us really believed that it would work. This was in 1990, and the internet was not available, so the only things we knew about Ouija boards was what we'd seen in movies, etc. Almost immediately, the glass started to move. I looked closely at the glass, but there were at least 6 of us touching it. I tried to see who was the person who was pushing the glass, but from what I could tell, we were all touching it that lightly that often our fingers would break contact with the glass. The glass zoomed effortlessly from one letter to the next, much faster than anything I had ever seen on a movie. The glass was thick, heavy, and because of this, I was almost certain someone was pushing it. I decided to test it out. I asked the name of the entity that we were speaking with. It claimed its name was Beelzebub. Everyone at the table seemed to look puzzled, although I had a religious upbringing with my grandparents, the married couple that my grandfather who had passed away was part of. So I knew what it meant. I still believed someone was pushing the glass so, and thought that they too knew what that name meant, and that they were messing with the rest of us. I decided to test it out further, and asked if that entity could bring forth any spirit that we wanted to speak to. It agreed, and when I asked for my grandfather again, it said yes. Moments later, I asked if my grandfather was present, and was told yes. I really thought I was about to catch out the person that was messing with us, and I was about to prove it. My grandfather had an affectionate nickname for me that only a few people ever heard. And once he had passed away, no one ever used that nickname ever again. When I was really little, the nickname was Teeny Weeny Bonna. I still never revealed what that name was. When I was a preteen, it had become just Bonna, and just before my grandfather had died, it had evolved into Big Bonna. I asked the entity if it was truly my grandfather, then it could easily tell me the nickname I was called before he died. I had actually forgotten about the teeny weeny or the big. This is for those psychologists who believe that Ouija boards work because the person using them is subconsciously pushing the planchette themselves. I was thinking that the answer was Bonna, and did not believe for an instant that the board would spell out the correct name. The planchette moved to B and I gasped, but then it moved to I. And that's when I thought that the person messing with us just got lucky by getting the first letter correct. And now I was about to get proof that this whole thing was a joke. When the planchette moved to G, I suddenly started to cry as the memories of him calling me Big Bonna. Bonna is a replacement for the original nickname. I still don't share it with anyone what his name was for me. Came flooding back. I had forgotten about that, and to be honest, the exact question I asked was, "What did you call me before you died?" The board had not only gotten the question correct, but it had corrected me from the thought I had in my head. I asked a few other questions, but to be honest, the answers did not sit well with the religious upbringing that I had, so I'm not inclined to talk too long on those. I will answer anyone honestly who asks me what I was told, but I don't talk about any of this often. The rest of the group that was performing the seance with me did not know what to make out of what was going on. They did not know if the answer was correct or not, but considering my reaction, they assumed it was. They still continued to play, though. None of them were frightened off, although this was the one and only seance we did while away on this trip, no matter how bored we were. Although we continued to play, I did not like the other responses to the questions we asked. My grandfather was religious, and until his health failed him, he attended church every Sunday and upheld his religious beliefs, incorporating them into his daily life until the day he passed. During this session, the entity we were speaking to told us that he was not in heaven, nor was he in hell. Instead, he was in limbo. He told us that to get to heaven there was a maze, but there was also a maze to enter hell. Apparently, the maze to heaven was much harder than the maze to hell, so instead he decided to wait in limbo. He also told me that he was not alone. He had a friend, but his friend was a demon. This was the point where I decided to end the game. I found it confusing. Even if this was the truth, I doubt that my grandfather would ever have encouraged me to make friends with a demon. I never admitted to my family about this Ouija session, or the fact that I spoke with something that claimed to be my grandfather. It did know answers to the questions that no one else could know. And if this entity had the ability to read my mind or look for the correct answer, it gave me the answer I was not thinking of. Nevertheless, it was correct. When I returned home after this holiday away, I never confessed to my mother or my father what we did that day. One night when asleep, I had a dream of my grandfather. The dream was bizarre, as dreams often are. It was just myself and my grandfather sitting on a cartoon-style island, a pile of sand with one palm tree, sitting in the shade of this palm tree, sharing a cigarette. It wasn't the theme of the dream that was important, though. It was what happened during this dream that had me reeling. I thought I knew my grandfather well. During this dream, though, everything that had taken me 13 years to notice about him, his scent, the sound he made when he breathed, the nicotine stains on his fingers, everything, all came flooding back to me at once. I could even smell his tobacco. This dream seemed more realistic than seeing him in real life. I woke up crying, not because I was frightened or anything like that, but because the dream had ended and I wanted more time. I tried to explain what had happened to my mother, but she seemed to believe I was having some kind of breakdown, not even attempting to understand what I was telling her. She took all the pictures I had of my grandfather and she hid them. She told me I would get them back when she was sure that I had calmed down and was coping with the loss of him better than what she assumed I was at that point in life. 2 years later, when I was 16, I had moved interstate back to Tasmania from Melbourne. and the relationship I had with my mother had been rocky for a while now. New Year's Eve of 1992 into 93, it had reached its breaking point, and the next day on New Year's Day, my mother drove me from rural northern Tasmania to Hobart, where she dropped me off at another aunt's house, and essentially I was kicked out of home. It took me 6 weeks to get on my feet. I found a temporary job which was enough to get some money together for a bond, and found myself a small bedsit flat. Once I was about to move in, my mother shipped the last of my belongings down to me. The day I went to move into my flat, I actually met the previous tenant. The flats I was moving into were 3 bedsit flats on the top floor, and 2-bedroom flats on the bottom floor. The previous tenant had just become a father and was moving from a bedsit flat and into one of the larger flats downstairs with his girlfriend and newborn baby. As we were introduced, he mentioned something about voices and the chimney. The flat I was moving into was the only one on the top floor that had an open fireplace. It was the older style, and not the ones with glass doors. I had to purchase a fire screen, etc., so that I could use it, as it gets very cold in Hobart during winter. I did not quite understand what he meant about the voices, and when I asked him to repeat himself, he just glanced at the landlord and then back at me, telling me, "Nothing, don't worry about it." And then he left to go down to his new home. I settled in quickly into my first new flat, and it wasn't until a couple of days later that I noticed something odd that brought me back to the first meeting of the previous tenant. I could clearly hear a male and female talking. The voices seemed to be coming from down my chimney, but the house was a double-story house. Unlikely that anyone was on my roof. At the time, I thought perhaps it was the acoustics of my neighbors traveling from across 2 yards, and then down my chimney, and I thought nothing more about it. I could not hear what they were saying. The only thing I could tell was it was a rather civil conversation. Now that I'm older, I know that there is no way that the conversation of my neighbors, whose house was over 10 meters away from mine, would travel out through their walls, up to my rooftop, and then down my chimney. With outside interference such as traffic, etc., and the isolation of the neighboring house walls, combined with the distance this noise would have had to travel, it was just not possible to be coming from my neighbors. I still did not think it was anything supernatural. One day I was cleaning up, dusting, and I had a small crystal pyramid. I knocked over a few items, and in frustration I threw a teen tantrum. I picked up that pyramid and threw it to the ground. I heard it hit the ground. Once I had thrown it, I decided to pick it up and put it back, but it was nowhere to be seen. It couldn't be under my bed. My bed had drawers underneath the mattress, and there was no gap for this crystal to fit. I searched high and low for it, yet there was nowhere it could have fallen, and no matter how much I looked, this crystal had just disappeared. It wasn't until 6 months later when I decided to get a flannel shirt for my wardrobe, a shirt I had not worn for a very long time. I happened to notice something in his pocket. It was a crystal pyramid I had lost months earlier. I had no idea how it got into the pocket of this shirt. It was impossible. That shirt was not out of my wardrobe when I threw the crystal, and my wardrobe was not even open at the time. I still did not think it was paranormal, though. Just really confusing and odd. The next event is what sealed the deal as far as paranormal was concerned. I had a very tiny flat with no room for a couch or table and chairs, so a group of 5 of us were sitting on the floor in a circle, talking to each other. One of my friends asked for a glass of water, which I stood up and got for him. About 10 minutes later, there was someone pounding on my door. They were not knocking, it was a pound, and my door shook every time it was hit. The intensity of every hit made everyone in my flat on edge. No one at the time thought it was paranormal, just an impatient or rude visitor. I stood up and walked over to my door, getting ready to open it, and tell whoever it was knocking at my door that it was rather rude to be knocking in such a way. As I got up next to the door, my foot brushed against something. I looked down and realized that I almost kicked over a glass of water. I picked it up and asked my friend if that was his water. We were seated in such a way that there was no way any of us could move from the circle without the others noticing. My friend looked to his left and right, searching for his drink. Once he realized that the glass of water was his, my friends started putting their shoes back on their feet, and were looking at my door nervously. The whole time the pounding at my door had not stopped. My guests moved up behind me, and Just as there was a pound on my door, I swung it open quickly. There was no one there. And certainly not enough time for someone to run in the middle of a knock and hide in the laundry room or communal lounge room we had. All of my friends ran from the flat, screaming. I calmly walked back in, picked up my shoes, and followed them outside. There was no way to deny what we'd all just seen. But at the end of the day, I had nowhere else to go and had to return to my flat. After that event, I would occasionally get knocking at my door. Not as intense as the first time, but it continued. At least once every 2 weeks. So now I had voices down my chimney, disappearing items, and knocking at my door. Then one night I had a visitor over. It was a quiet Sunday night and there was no traffic on the road. It was about 10 p.m., and any sound from down the street would travel because it was so quiet. We both noticed that in the distance we could hear heavy boots running on the road. We figured that because at the time it was popular for teens to wear boots, Dr. Martens or army boots from army disposal stores, etc. It sounded like there was maybe 5 or so people running. We figured it was just a few teens that had been up to some kind of mischief and were running away from the scene of the crime. We did find it odd that we could hear no laughing or talking, though. But I just put it down to the fact that they were running and maybe they did not have enough breath to run and talk. My friend and I just ignored them and continued our conversation. I noticed that the running seemed to get closer and closer, but I just figured that they would run past our flats and thought nothing more about it. I was sitting on my bed at the time, and my bed was right up against my window. I lived in a bedsit flat, which is just a one-room flat with a tiny kitchen and bathroom that was an extension built off the side of the building. I did not have a typical bedroom or sitting room. It was just all one room except for the kitchen and bathroom. This was why the flats on the top floor had a communal lounge room and a communal laundry. The concrete steps that led to the landing at the top of the second floor ran right past my bedroom window. All the tenants had a key to the front door, and then another individual key for their own flat. The landing at the top of the stairs was not even 1 meter across and 1 meter wide. It was just enough room for maybe 3 people to stand until the front door was unlocked and you could enter. Anyway, I noticed how close those footsteps were getting, but they were still no concern to me. It wasn't until a few minutes later that I realized something was not right. Those heavy running footsteps were running up the stairs outside my window, and there were not 5 or so. It was an unending stream, sounded like over 50 people were running up the steps. The noise was so loud it could not be ignored. My friend and I both knew the door was locked, and even if it was unlocked, we would have heard people entering and walking on the wooden floor in the entrance and hallway. My friend and I looked at each other in confusion. We knew what we could hear was impossible. There was also only footsteps, no voices. I decided to carefully peel back the corner of my blind to see what was going on. The moment that I had the tiniest view of the stairs, the steps stopped. It was completely silent all of a sudden. It had gone from a really loud noise, which reminded me of perhaps soldiers or firemen frantically running up those steps, to absolutely nothing. I have heard disembodied voices before, but I've never heard anything like that before, nor have I heard it since. Just to be safe, I hung a crucifix above my door as you entered my flat. I had no idea if this would help me or not, but I had no idea what I was dealing with, and I was concerned. It was not enough to frighten me from my home, but I knew this was not normal. And now, if there had been any doubt about paranormal experiences, it had completely vanished. After a week or so, I noticed that although the crucifix remained above my door on the inside of my flat, on the outside wall of my flat, exactly opposite where I had the crucifix hanging, the paint had peeled away. It had peeled away in the shape, the exact same size of the crucifix I had hanging in my room. After about a year, I decided to move to the other end of the state to be closer to my family. I did not leave because of the apartment haunting. I recall feeling a sort of melancholy that my haunting would end, and this new experience in my life that changed my perspective would be coming to an end. It took me a few moves before I started to settle down. I stayed at my mother's house for a week, and then a friend of the family for a week, before settling at my friend's auntie's house for a while. At this point in time, I was living in a rural city called Devonport in northern Tasmania. I noticed that whenever I stayed somewhere for a minimum of 2 weeks, that the activity I thought I had left behind in Hobart would start up again. Nothing drastic, just items moving that shouldn't move the way they did, or knocks on the door, etc. Usually it would happen when I was alone. There were not many witnesses during the first year to the activity that followed me. After drifting around for about a year, my brother asked if I would consider moving into a unit with him. I jumped at this opportunity, as there is very little work in Devonport. So most young people end up having to share a house with others, and I was looking forward to living with just one other person in a unit, rather than 4 to 6 others in a house just to afford the rent. After I had lived with my brother for 2 weeks, I decided that I should warn him about the entity that was following me. I asked him to take a seat, as I have something important to tell him. I sat on a large, long divan, which was just 2 slabs of thick foam covered in a thick material, and stacked so that they were like a couch. My brother sat opposite myself in a chair. There was a coffee table between us, but we were only about a meter apart from each other. On the divan beside me there was a plastic shopping bag that was empty, and a thick leather belt that had an interchangeable heavy belt buckle. I knew that my brother was going to think I was losing my mind, but I decided to go through with the conversation anyway. I told him that I was haunted by something. Usually the entity that was haunting me would take at least 2 weeks before the activity started, every time I moved. And because we had been living together at this point for 2 weeks, I thought it was only fair that I tell him about it. I also made sure to mention that whatever it was that was haunting me had never tried to hurt me or anyone else I knew about. I wanted to make sure he had no reason to be afraid of it. My brother obviously did not believe me and gave me a look of pity and disappointment. I told him I knew what he was thinking, that he thought I was crazy. I had no problem with that. And I told him that I did not care if he chose to believe me or not, but I just wanted him to remember this conversation. And when he finally noticed something happening that he could not explain, then there was no reason to be afraid of it. I believed that it just wanted to let us know it was there, just wanted to get our attention. Before my brother could respond, I heard a sort of rustling beside me. I turned to see what was going on and noticed that the bag and the heavy leather belt were moving along the length of the divan. It slid about 1.5 meters along the divan before it reached the end and fell off. It looked as though someone had used their arm and swept it along the couch to clear it of any items. As soon as the bag and belt fell off the end, the foam cushion beside me sunk down. I could clearly see the imprint of buttocks and the tops of someone's legs. I just sat there and stared. The impression remained for about 10 seconds, and then suddenly it dissipated as if it had never been there. It did not look like it stood up, but instead it looked as though the person sitting there just dissolved. I looked over at my brother to see if he had noticed any of this. He was staring blankly at the area beside me, his face pale and his mouth hanging open. He stood up slowly and silently and headed straight out the back door. I followed him to see if he was okay. He was crouching down beside the door, trying to smoke a cigarette, his hands shaking. I asked him if he was okay, and he nodded. I then asked him if he now believed me, or did he think I was still crazy. He nodded that he believed me now, and we have never spoken of that moment again since. By this point, I have given this entity a name. I called him Fred. I don't know why I think it was a him, and I don't know why I chose the name Fred. The activity continued, but it was just small items being moved, and was rarely noticed by anyone else. After a year of living in Devonport, I was disappointed with the lack of employment opportunities, so I decided to move to Melbourne. At first I moved to a backpackers until I was able to find somewhere more suitable. Eventually I found a small flat in an inner-city suburb, Northcote. Fred had gone really quiet and had not made any appearance since I had moved to Melbourne. And as it had been a year earlier, I thought that perhaps now he had finally moved on to somewhere else. I was 18 at this point. One night while laying in bed with my partner, I noticed a poster I had hanging on my wardrobe door. I'd used sticky tack to hold it up. I noticed the bottom left corner first. It slowly lifted up until the contact with the sticky tack had been broken, and then it went over to the bottom right side, repeating the process. Next it moved onto the top left corner and then the top right. Once it had finally broken the contact between the sticky tack and my wardrobe door, the picture fell. I considered what I had just seen. If it had been gravity that had caused the picture to fall, even though there was plenty of sticky tack holding it onto the door, gravity should have made the top corners lose contacts first. My partner must have noticed the same thing, and must have had the same thought, because suddenly he broke out in prayer. I told him he was free to leave if he felt uncomfortable. He did not live with me, he was just visiting. But he chose to stay that night. A few nights later, my partner was complaining that he had lost his wallet. Suddenly I had a strong inclination to look towards my room, and then I stood up and walked over to my bed. I stuck my hand under my bed in an area where there was nothing but shadow visible. I put my hand directly on top of his missing wallet. Okay, so this could have been complete coincidence, but my partner swore he checked there multiple times and could not believe he had missed it. He even accused me of taking it and then placing it under my bed so that I could find it for him later. There was nothing missing from his wallet, and I asked him why I would do that. What could I get from behaving in such a way? I ended up asking him to leave. I did not appreciate his accusations. Later that night, I woke with a start. I don't know how high it was lifted, but I was woken up by the foot end of my bed being dropped. I felt it drop at least a foot to the ground. It may have been higher, but I know that the end of my bed had been lifted up by at least a foot. This did not scare me. I was fascinated with the fact that Fred had seemingly finally returned to me, if he had left at all. Things were not going well with my partner, and I ended up ending the relationship. For whatever reason, Fred always seemed to become more active when I was having periods of times during my life where I was suffering stress more than usual. Perhaps the breakup with that partner was the reason Fred decided to remind me he was still around. I have no idea. About a week or so after my bed had dropped, I was standing in my bathroom brushing my teeth. Now, whenever something happened, I would never just assume it was being caused by Fred. I always looked for another explanation first before thinking it was paranormal. I turned off my cold water tap and started to brush my hair. I suddenly noticed that the hot water tap started to turn and was turning itself on. I watched for over half a minute while the tap kept turning. It continued turning until once it had reached the point until the water pressure was at its strongest and could no longer flow any stronger. I was thinking to myself at the time, perhaps built-up water pressure could cause this, and I even recall thinking it would be impressive if it now turned itself off. No longer had I this passing thought. The tap started to turn again, this time in the opposite direction. It continued turning once more until it had finally turned itself off. Although I was used to Fred showing up randomly, there still had a shock factor to it, as I was standing directly in front of the sink, and for any entity to perform that act, they would have had to reach through myself to do that. I had to leave the bathroom and sit out the front of my flat to have a cigarette before re-entering again. The activity continued, but I told no one about this. It was nothing too traumatic. I recall it once threw an empty pack of cigarettes off my coffee table, and that hit me in the ankle. Even though it threw an item at me because it was so insignificant, I never saw it as a physical threat. I also remember watching a glass of water I had just placed on my bench top slide about half a meter across, before it stopped at the end. After some time, I started seeing another partner. This time I pre-warned him of the activity that had been following me by this time for about nearly 5 years. This partner had children from a previous relationship, and one night his kids stayed over. The youngest became visibly upset because he realized he'd forgotten to bring his favorite teddy with him for comfort. He never went anywhere without that toy, so instead, I went into my room and brought out my special teddy. It was a Snoopy teddy that I had owned since I was 5 years old, and this teddy was very special to me. I said if he wanted to, he could borrow it for the night. I could not believe it, but it worked. He was actually ready to substitute his favorite toy for a night. So that his sister did not feel left out, I also brought out another teddy bear that I had owned for a year longer than the Snoopy. I had that bear placed on my bench top as the kids got ready for bed. As a young girl walked past the bench and headed to the bathroom, the bear flew off the bench top and hit her in the back. Both myself and her father watched this happen, but because it was so light, the girl kept walking. She did not even notice the event, so we thought it was best not to tell her. Now she is an adult. We have shared that story with her, and she gets a giggle from it because she has seen Fred's activity quite a few times in the past, and he has never made her feel uncomfortable. After some time, my new partner, we had been dating for over a year by now, decided to get a house together. We lived there for a couple of years. After we first moved in, we noticed occasionally that things would go missing. I would be reading a book and would put it down beside me for a moment, but when I went to pick it up, it had gone. My wallet disappeared, car keys went missing, house keys went missing. We actually wanted to go out one day, and the day that the house keys went missing, yet again, as these were a replacement set, we were delayed in being able to leave while we were looking. It took us about 15 minutes to find the keys, and we were finally able to leave. Just as we turned onto the main road, we noticed traffic backed up. As we got closer, we discovered that the traffic was being delayed due to an accident which had just occurred. If we had left on time when we wanted to leave, then there was a strong possibility that we would have been involved in that car accident. I now strongly believed that Fred not only had no inclination to hurt us, but on occasion he would even attempt to protect us. Over half a year we had lost track of the items that had disappeared, though. There was a cupboard underneath our kitchen sink which I opened several times a day. This is where I kept the dishwashing cloths and dishwashing liquid. I know I would open it at least twice a day, if not more. Then one day when I opened this cupboard, I noticed on the bottom shelf a pile of items. I picked them all up and realized that these were all the missing items that had disappeared over the previous 6 months. Books, wallets, keys, trinket boxes. There was no reason or pattern to the type of items that showed up. Fred started to quieten down again, but there was still the odd occurrence that let us know he was still around. Years pass, and we moved several times during this time. I am now 26 years old. I am pregnant and about to have my first child. There were no complications with my pregnancy, and the birth went well. I was able to leave the hospital after only one night, and was happy to be home with my newborn son. I only had a bassinet for him to sleep in, but it had no stand. I bought a sturdy coffee table and placed the bassinet on top of this, and placed it to the side of my bed. The bassinet was between my built-in wardrobe and the bed. It took up most of the room there, and there was only a few centimeters gap between the wardrobe, bed, and bassinet. My first night at home, just as I am about to drift off to sleep. I knew my partner was lying beside me, and I felt the hair being swept off my forehead and a kiss placed on my forehead. The sensation it gave me was that of pure love. It reminded me of the same kind of feeling a child would get if it were stormy outside, and their parent rugged them in a warm blanket and held them tight. It was very comforting and left an amazing impression on me. The next morning I mentioned to my partner that the kiss that he gave me the night before was very sweet. That's when he mentioned that he did not kiss me. I thought about it for a moment, and then realized that the direction that the hair being brushed off of my forehead and the kiss had come from was the direction of where the bassinet was. My partner was laying on the opposite side of the bed, and there was no way a human could fit in the small gap between the bassinet and the bed. My son had plenty of toys, but as a newborn, he could not really interact with a lot of them until he was at least 6 months old and sit upright. He had a couple of toys that were triggered by movement and pressure. It would giggle and vibrate in response. My son used to crawl away to the front door or to his room and play quietly. At the time, my son had started crawling and seemed quite content to crawl from his room to the front door and play quietly by himself. I was amazed at how independent he seemed to be. Of course, he always found his way to me if he needed a nappy change or feeding, but other than that, he was always playing by himself. This was the way he preferred it. I often would hear his giggling toy making noise, and I could hear the vibration of it on the floorboards in his room. I assumed that it was one of his favorite toys. One day I was in the lounge room with my son. We were the only 2 people in the house, and he was in my lap while drinking his bottle. Just as he was about to take a nap with his stomach full, I heard it. The giggle and vibration of his favorite toy. As I knew we were alone, and I had no pets to trigger this toy, I automatically thought of Fred again. I just thought that Fred had discovered this toy and was testing it out. A couple of days later, I was walking past my son's room when I thought to stop at the doorway to check up on him. I could see a ball rolling across on the other side of the room, nowhere near my son, and it was not coming from the direction of my son either. My son did not have the dexterity to roll the ball hard enough for it to have been rolled by him and then bounce off something else to change its direction. Then I heard that giggling toy again. I looked for it and noticed it was about a meter away from my son. At the time, my son was happily chewing on the corner of a wooden car. He was teething, but was content to be surrounded by his toys, which appeared to either be activating by themselves or moving on their own. This activity was not overwhelming. Usually it was just one toy at a time, except for that giggling toy, which would go off randomly at any time. My son seemed content, and just sat happily there watching the room. We lived in this house for about a year, and that giggling toy was a constant. After the kiss and the fact that Fred seemed interested in playing with my son, I just figured that as long as my son was not upset by him, then I would let them be. After a year of living there, we were offered an opportunity we could not refuse. As we were renting, we were offered the tenancy of our local Baptist church manse. We did not attend this church, but we had many friends that did, and the pastor decided that because he was purchasing his home with his wife, he did not want to take up residence in the manse. So instead of letting it sit vacant, the church decided to rent it out. From the front, it did not look like anything special, but this house was huge. It had the usual 3 bedrooms, average house size for the area we lived in, but the kitchen and dining area was massive. It was all an open area, but the kitchen and dining area were separated by bench tops. The built-in drawers were so large that my son could easily climb into one and hide. We purchased a pool table to place at the end of the lounge, and at the other end we had a dining table and couch, TV, typical lounge room setup. There was so much room that my son could still have the room to ride his tricycle inside as well. For us this was great because there was no fence between our neighbor's yard and our backyard. Our neighbor had 2 dogs who had no idea of property boundary lines, and they were rather protective over the land that they believed was theirs. We really did not have access to our backyard at all, but at least the house was large enough to set up a clothesline, etc. We tried to politely ask our neighbors to bring their dogs into their homes so we could use the clothesline at the back, but one day they had visitors, and although we were polite about it, they were very rude and declined our request. I tried to call the pound, explaining that the neighbors' dogs were in our yard and stopping me from being able to gain access, but the pound wanted nothing to do with the situation. The excuse they had was that if someone came over and the dogs were not on our property, then it was a waste of their time. In the end, I gave the neighbors 10 minutes warning. I told them to either take their dogs inside or lose them, because I was about to remove my gate to my backyard, which would have meant that their dogs could escape. I know how horrid that sounds, but they were refusing to install a fence to keep their dogs in their own property, and in the meantime they were restricting us access to our own yard. I can only imagine that they did this because it gave them a much larger yard for themselves to use. My threat worked. But to prove my point and assist in getting a fence constructed as soon as possible, I still removed my gate, and I left it removed until the fence was built. This took quite a few months from the moment we moved in until the moment the fence was constructed, which meant that the only place for my son to safely play was inside. I was grateful at least that there was plenty of room for him. His giggling toy was constantly being set off multiple times a day. At first I thought it may have been a fault or a glitch with the toy, but if that was the case, then the toy should have kept going off continuously. Instead, it would go off once, and then perhaps it would be an hour or so before it would trigger again. After making my bed one day, I walked past my son's bedroom door to see him playing with a ball. He had a built-in wardrobe, but it was completely empty. All his clothes were folded and stored in a tall boy chest of drawers. There were no shoes or anything on the ground of the wardrobe to change a ball's direction. I was watching my son kicking the ball gently into the wardrobe. Because he was so young, the strength he was able to kick it with was barely enough for it to make it into the wardrobe. But a second or so later, the ball would return to him. I stood there in his doorway, calmly watching my son play with his soft, inflatable rubber ball. My partner and stepson noticed me standing in the hallway watching something going on in my son's room, so they walked down the hallway to see what it was that had my attention. They stood beside me, watching what seemed like an invisible force in the wardrobe playing kickball with my son. My stepson, who was now a teenager, nudged us and said, "Watch this," as he walked into my son's room, and as the ball rolled out towards my son, he placed his foot on the ball and stopped it. My son was not bothered by this. He just assumed that his older brother was going to join in on the game. My stepson took a big swing and kicked the ball into the wardrobe with force. The ball entered the wardrobe and then stopped. For a few seconds we waited to see what was going to happen. Then, suddenly, the ball returned. Instead of returning across the floor like it had been doing when playing with my son, the ball became airborne. It left the ground and traveled in an upwards motion, hitting my stepson in his forehead. There was no way that this ball would hurt anyone, it was too soft. So we all knew that there was no way the ball hitting my stepson in the head was going to hurt him, so we all started to laugh, except for my infant son, as he did not understand the situation he had just witnessed. Even my stepson found it hilarious. We told him that he got what he deserved. He interrupted a pleasant and gentle game of kickball with an infant, and was basically being a cheeky teenager. My stepson obviously agreed, but this only proved to us that there was definitely something paranormal that was playing with my son. There was absolutely nothing in that wardrobe that could have made that ball get airborne, and the lapse in time from him kicking the ball into the wardrobe and the ball returning was also unexplainable. He kicked it with so much force that it should have hit the back of the wardrobe and returned to him instantly, but there was a 3 to 4 second lapse in the time where the ball just seemed to stop once it entered the wardrobe. Even though my stepson was hit in the head with the ball, none of us saw that as an act of violence or an attack. Time went on, and we ended up moving to yet another house. By now my son was 5 years old, and I was nearly 9 months pregnant with his sister. One day I walked past my son in the hallway, and he was talking to someone. But he was looking at the ceiling, in the farthest and darkest part of the hallway. I asked him who he was talking to, and he replied, "The old man in the photograph. But he has a sore." I asked him to show me which old man he was talking about, and he led me to a picture of my grandfather and told me that he thought it was him. I asked him about the sore because my grandfather had passed away from a heart and lung collapse and did not die of an external injury. My son used his index finger and drew a large Y across his chest and down his sternum. It reminded me of where a body would be cut when an autopsy was being done. I thought about it, but as far as I knew, my grandfather was in hospital and died of natural causes, so I don't think there was a reason for an autopsy. I found out later that because my grandfather had worked with asbestos when he was younger, and it appeared that he had emphysema, they would have done an autopsy to check for mesothelioma, as back in those times it was the only way to be certain of the cause of death. There were no accurate tests for mesothelioma back then, and it would appear identical to emphysema. I waited for my son to wander away far enough for him to not hear what I had to say. I have never really addressed Fred out loud, but now things had to change. I politely pointed out that I have never had an issue with him interacting with my son, and had accepted his presence for the past 10 years, yet I would appreciate it if he was going to appear to my son to please not make it so graphic. I did not like the idea of my son witnessing someone with autopsy cuts on their body. Although at that stage my son was not scared, I was concerned about how he would feel as he grew older and realized how gruesome his vision of this entity was. From that point onwards, Fred almost disappeared from our lives. I did not ask him to leave, but he seemed to have gone so quiet that if he was still around, it was barely noticeable. Now, my youngest child is 14, but Fred had remained so quiet, and for the first 10 years of my daughter's life, she had only ever really heard stories about Fred. She occasionally asked me why did Fred disappear when she was born, and she seemed to think that perhaps he left because of her. I told her that if he had left, then it had nothing to do with her, and she was not missing out on anything, as it was occasionally startling to witness his behavior. Then, about 4 years ago, it started again. Due to the size of the small house we live in now, I share a room with my daughter. She sleeps on the top bunk, and I sleep on the bottom. Fred often sits on the bottom bunk when I am asleep, and wakes me up when I feel the mattress shift. I often think it's my daughter climbing down to use the bathroom during the night or something. He often knocks over drink bottles or throws small objects off her dresser, etc. For the past 4 years, she has slowly began to see what Fred is like. Yet she too is not afraid of him. Then 2 weeks ago, as I am writing this down, I had some news delivered to me. I did not get along with my mother. She suffers from narcissist personality disorder, and is unable to feel empathy or love. She used me as a child to hurt my father when they divorced, and her behavior towards me over the years was despicable. When my daughter was born, my mother attempted to bully me into doing something I did not want to participate in. It was illegal and would have resulted in charges being laid against myself. I declined and turned my phone off so that the constant calls and bullying attempts would stop. This occurred just after my daughter was born, and so, because my mother was not getting her way, she attempted to use my children against me. She told me she was going to report to the Department of Child Welfare that I was selling illegal substances, completely untrue, and that she was going to have my children removed from my custody and she would take them in. She informed me that she had already done this once to my brother, so I should not doubt her. I know my brother had temporarily lost custody of his kids to my mother, and now I knew why. I knew that as long as my mother had custody of my kids, I would have to do whatever she asked me to do, as I knew what kind of danger they would be in. She never protected myself, so I doubted she would protect my kids either. I ended up having to get a restraining order placed on her. This worked, and for a year she could not make contact with me. As soon as the order expired, she sent me a rather threatening letter, informing me that if she did not get her own way, and if she did not get to see her grandkids before she died, at the time she was perfectly healthy, then she was going to haunt me. I found this slightly laughable, as my mother had absolutely no belief in the paranormal, but I knew otherwise. I took the threatening letter she wrote me back to the courts and applied for another restraining order. It was approved for another year. Once the second one expired, I phoned my mother to sort of test out what her mood would be like this time. I was hoping she would realize that I was not going to tolerate her rubbish. She broke down in tears, asking why I had done that to her. I reminded her of the threats she made. I could hear her crying loudly at the other end of the phone and denying it all. Her tears were so convincing, I started to doubt my own sanity. The only reason I was able to stand strong was that the threats had come from her mobile phone number, and mentioned conversations that I had only had with her, etc. The judge would never have approved 2 restraining orders unless I was able to prove the harassment. I decided for my own sanity and the sake of my children to break contact with her. It hurt me very much, as she was still my mother. But this personality disorder does not offer many options. Anyway, the news I received 2 weeks ago was that she was terminally ill and has months to live. The threat she made about haunting me suddenly came back to me, and then I thought about Fred. I remembered that when I was younger, Fred was usually at his most active when I was under extreme emotional distress. I found myself wondering if Fred would make a stronger appearance in the coming months. Just as I had that thought, I heard a crash from my kitchen. At the time, my son was in there with his friend, and they were making something to eat, so I assumed that they dropped a plate, and my son would either burst through my door any moment to tell me, or he would wait until the following day. The next day, my son admitted it to me, but claimed it was not him. A plate had gone flying off the table and hit the ground and shattered. This was probably the most violent thing Fred has ever done, and it was not directed at anyone, but it did result in a plate being broken. My son's friend does not know about Fred, and his reaction was, "Is your house haunted or something?" And then he just nervously laughed it off. My son just ignored the question and pretended he had no idea what caused this to happen. This is what prompted me to post my experience on Reddit. The fact that my mother is now terminally ill, has months to live, and now Fred has started to become strongly active again. For years now, he has kept his activity to just being around myself, sitting on my bed, poking my shoulder, tussling my hair. Nothing worth overreacting to. But as of a week ago, he made an abrupt appearance in front of my son and his friend, and it was obvious and loud. I can only assume that he is reminding me, and us all, that he is still here and has never really left us. None of us fear him. But my children do get startled when he makes appearances, or rather because we cannot see him when he makes a commotion. Because it's so random and there is no warning. So it can be a bit startling when something unexpected occurs right next to you. Hey everybody, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Paranormal Stories, episode 223. And thank you very much to everybody who allowed me to use their stories in this video. Special thanks goes to the author of story number 5, who I believe wants to remain anonymous, but I do appreciate taking the time to write the extra long version of the story. It took a bit of time to record, of course, but very much worth it in the end, and I appreciate all the extra information. Right, see, what day is this? Friday, gotta get down on Friday. Okay. If I get done with work early enough, I might do another little stream, if I'm feeling it. I'm kind of, if the mood sneaks upon me, as I suspect it may, another little stream. Maybe not as long as yesterday, but we went for 5 hours yesterday. I didn't realize it had been that long. We'll see what mood I'm in by the time I'm done with work. Okay, I'm gonna head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourself.